Welcome, everybody. It's 11 o'clock, and we are going to start our panel now. My name is Aaron Belkin. I'm director of Take Back the Court, and I'm so grateful to our hosts at Netroot Nation and my colleague and progressive icon, Murshid Zahid, and also to our incredible panelists, Mondaire Jones, Tamaro Tolles O'Laughlin, and Dan Pfeiffer for joining us this morning. I want to start by saying that court expansion is a topic that has gained an incredible amount of momentum over the last 2 years, and I've been proud to be a part of that process as the conversation ramped up. I think there's been a growing awareness among progressives that the entire progressive agenda is jeopardized by the Supreme Court, and democracy itself may be hanging by a thread unless the court is expanded. And we're going to elaborate on some of the themes and questions associated with court expansion today. And I'd like to start by asking Mondaire Jones, the next congressman from the New York 17th District. You published a piece in Salon about court expansion during your campaign. Why were you talking about court expansion during your campaign, and why did you come out so strongly in favor of it? You're on mute.
First of all, I want to say thank you all so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here talking about a topic that has become increasingly important to me. And as you noted, I did champion this issue in the course of my very crowded Democratic primary. And I'm grateful to have emerged on the other side of that unscathed in talking about this in a way that is causing more people to take notice. This is increasingly important because we are now beginning to imagine life after Donald Trump. And when we talk about what's broken in our political system, I want to make the observation that we spend a lot of time talking about the presidency and Congress, but not enough time talking about the Supreme Court. So I'm thrilled that we have groups like Take Back the Court and 350 doing the important work to raise public consciousness around this hugely important issue. Why should we be talking about the Supreme Court, to your question? For me, it's not just because I'm an attorney concerned about the rule of law, though I am, because it is constantly under assault. The main reason I'm here at Netroots talking about court expansion is because this issue is personal to me. I am a Black person in America who is extremely frustrated that people who look like me have an unnecessarily difficult time voting all across this country, the thing that John Lewis risked his life for on Bloody Sunday. I am a gay person who is horrified by what has become an annual ritual, spending the month of June every year waiting to see if 5 justices on the Supreme Court will vote to take away my civil rights. I am also a candidate for Congress who comes from a working class background and just emerged, as I mentioned earlier, from a very expensive 8-person primary in which one of my opponents, the son of a billionaire, spent $5.4 million of his pharmaceutical industry fortune in an attempt to essentially buy that election. And it's not just me. The erosion of our democracy lies at the root of all of the issues that interrupt our daily existence. If you ask yourself why we have a for-profit healthcare system that leaves millions uninsured during a global pandemic, why we are prioritizing fossil fuel industry profits over the survival of our planet, why we are bailing out big corporations while only a fraction of working people get a one-time $1,200 check, and 32% of American households could not make their housing payments in the month of July, it is because our democracy is broken. So our People First movement must fight to restore this democracy and create a new vision for this country. And if we want to restore democracy, we have to rebalance the Supreme Court. The blame lies with the Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice Roberts. And the fact is, our democracy has been under assault for the past 2 decades, and the Roberts Court has dealt many of the sharpest blows. For all the recent talk of passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in a new Congress, most people glossed over the fact that we have a Supreme Court that likely would strike down key provisions of that statute all over again the way it did with the Voting Rights Act. Recall that one of the most indefensible decisions by the Roberts Court was Shelby County v. Holder, a 2013 decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act and made it even harder for all voters, especially Black voters, to cast their ballots. In his majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts famously declared that, quote, "things have changed in the South." But we have very clear evidence, from restrictive voter ID laws in Texas and North Carolina to illegal voter purges and polling place closures in Georgia, that Justice Roberts' assessment was delusional at best. Given the Supreme Court's track record of hostility to democracy, I also have serious doubts about its willingness to uphold H.R. 1, which is a set of democracy reforms known as the For the People Act. It is landmark legislation that already passed the House, by the way, in March 2019. And some of its features include automatic voter registration, an end to partisan gerrymandering of congressional districts through the development of independent redistricting commissions, and serious campaign finance reform, all of which are critical first steps in addressing the decades-long assault on our democracy. These items are going to help us obtain durable Democratic majorities in the House and Senate moving forward, which is essential to obtaining and preserving progressive legislative victories. We live in a time of crisis that requires Congress to enact big structural changes in our society. Aside from the pandemic, we have 10 years left to prevent irreversible climate catastrophe. Income inequality is the highest it's been in a century. More than 40 million Americans don't have health insurance, a number that's growing. And we know that a woman's right to choose is constantly under a threat, and the conservative majority on the Supreme Court could overturn Roe v. Wade whenever it wanted to. More than 2.3 million Americans are incarcerated, while 12 million undocumented people in this country live without legal protection. And of course, at least 33,000 people in the US die each year from gun violence. So I support court expansion because in order to solve these crises, we need a Supreme Court that will respect the will of the most progressive Congress in American history in just a few months. And thanks again for having me. I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you so much. Tamara Tolza-Laughlin, you are North America Director for 350.org, one of the vanguard, most powerful climate organizations in the world. But 350.org is not a judicial reform organization, it's a climate change organization. So why are you talking about the court?
So I'm here on behalf of the 4 generations of rabble-rousers who've been trying things. We are not specifically interested in one tactic versus another. We're here to push all the levers until we get action on climate change. So for us, as we champion things like a Green New Deal, demand climate reparations, move people from doing what they've been doing to what they need to do, we are deeply invested in using every tactic in the arsenal to move us to a place where we can have nuanced conversations about what needs to happen on climate. And that has not been happening enough in the legislature. That certainly hasn't happened at all in the executive. And so we're here to push for judicial responsibility, even if that means changing the way the court works, because for us, we cannot imagine that this climate that will be at the end of the climate decade without everything needing to change. We're looking for structural reform that will remake America. And none of these documents are, in fact, biblical text, sacred in any way, and people's penchant towards not wanting to touch them, move them, or make changes is more about our inability to have vision as a group, rather than our desire to see the change we want realized. So on behalf of all of those folks who will get in your face, be in your office, chase you down at your house, we are about this too.
Thank you so much. Dan Pfeiffer, you were senior assistant to President Obama, now co-host of Pod Save America, author of 2 incredible books, the most recent of which is Untrumping America. You were an institutionalist. You were in the White House for most of the Obama presidency, and yet in your latest book, you came out strong for court expansion. So what changed?
I think it's important to understand the Republican Party through the following prism, which is they are a party that represents a shrinking, mostly white conservative minority in this country. And every single decision they make is about preserving power in a country that is getting more diverse and more progressive every single day. And that is what voter suppression is about. That's what gerrymandering is about. And those are things that Democrats have the capacity to address at the ballot box by winning down ballot races, by winning governorships, by passing voting rights legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, H.R. 1, all of those things. But I have come to understand in the research of this book and watching everything that has happened since Mitch McConnell stole the Merrick Garland seat, is that the Supreme Court is the break glass solution for the right, which is if we do everything else right as a party, they still have the ability to use the Supreme Court, where there is a 6-3 conservative majority that will likely be there for decades to come. The statistic that keeps me up at night is that when Brett Kavanaugh is the age of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is today, my daughter will be in her early 30s. She is 2 right now. And I believe that so much of the reason that we have Donald Trump as president, the reason that so much is going on in this country goes back to the 2013 decision by John Roberts in the Shelby County v. Holder decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act. And if we cannot fix the Voting Rights Act to ensure that America acts more like the democracy we like to tell ourselves it is, then we're not going to be able to solve any of these other problems. And so the only way to do that is through a large reform of the courts, but that reform package must include court expansion, because otherwise we will be stuck with this 6-3 majority that was achieved on illegitimate terms. And the last thing I'd say about this is, in the course of looking at this and trying to figure out what Democrats do to solve this problem, it is very clear that expanding the court is a much more constitutional, it's a solution that's much more constitutional, much more within the tradition of American politics than what Mitch McConnell did to steal that seat. We have changed, the number 9 is not in the Constitution. It has been, the number of justices on the court has been changed many times over the years, and including in response to very specific political crises like the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And so this is a mainstream solution that will be put in place by passing laws by duly elected officials. And I think it is a critical solution to everything we care about, from democratic reform to economic reform to solving healthcare, and most importantly, to climate change.
Thank you so much. I want to pivot for a second and open up the conversation to the audience. If you have questions, just type them in the Q&A chat box, and I'm going to keep sending questions out to our panelists. But panelists, if you have comments on what another panelist says, please, of course, weigh in. So I'm going to ask one more of my own questions and then go to the questions from the Q&A. But Mondaire Jones, in your incredible Salon piece, and by the way, folks, if you have not read his Salon piece on court expansion, Google it. It's very, very powerful. But you said something that really struck me, and actually interested, of course, from all the panelists on this, but you said that some people worry that court expansion could lead to a death spiral of democracy, but the death spiral of democracy is already here. But I don't understand that, because, I mean, Democrats can still win elections. I mean, you're going to be the next congressman from the 17th of New York. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris hopefully will be the next occupants of the White House. What does that mean that the death spiral of democracy is already here?
Yeah, it by way of example means that we had a Congress, in particular a Senate led by Mitch McConnell, that, as Dan mentioned, left a vacancy on the Supreme Court undemocratically for nearly a year. And so when we talk about the way that the Supreme Court has changed in size, I mean, he did that sort of unilaterally, not through the passage of legislation. A death spiral. It means the gutting of the critical provision in the original Voting Rights Act, Section 5, which sets up a pre-clearance process that would have prevented things like what happened in the Georgia gubernatorial election, which was stolen from Stacey Abrams. It would have prevented so many of the voter suppression rules, regulations, and statutes that have proliferated, especially throughout the South in recent years, that have been intentionally enacted for the purpose of disenfranchising Black and brown people, making it far less likely that their voices will be heard at the ballot box. So we are in the midst of a death spiral. It is one that we don't have to pay too close attention to notice. We have now a president of the United States who says that he is defunding that he is seeking to literally defund the Postal Service and to make it significantly more difficult to participate in a vote-by-mail procedure in the midst of a global pandemic that people are comparing to a 1918 Spanish flu. So it's all out in the open right now, this assault on our democracy. It's not just the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court has aided and abetted this. And as I mentioned in my piece in Salon, it has dealt many of the sharpest blows.
I'm curious what the other panelists think of that. Tamara, do you agree? Is democracy hanging by a thread, or do you have more hope for the system than that? I mean, is court expansion part of the only way back, or where are you, and where's 350 on that question?
So we're definitely left of left. So this whole idea is really tenuous. I think a threat is generous relative to what Black and Brown communities are experiencing, what Indigenous people are not getting in terms of support, what every community made vulnerable by the system that currently exists has done to people. I think this is actually one of the best boosters for getting all those folks back into this conversation, is that we can either make reforms that will work, and as a last ditch effort towards undoing this whole thing. I would say that that's true at a number of levels, because since 2008, Kivalina versus Exxon, we've been in this moment where we're trying to figure out how do the courts become a branch that understands what's happening in climate. Juliana versus the U.S. is one specific. The Juliana case is one case where a national youth climate lawsuit got passed. There are ones happening in international sectors. Every state in the union will probably get involved in this act at some point, from the U.S. Virgin Islands to Massachusetts to Baltimore. All of those cases are moving. New York state attorneys general are taking it up because the costs of continuing to do business are showing up on people's door at the level of the municipality and the state. And as we start to suss out how we deal with the legions of folks who are becoming victims of climate, we desperately need a court that understands the science, that recognizes that justice isn't just going to be grandstanding in the street, isn't just going to be enabling legislation that moves us, isn't just going to be the special session of Congress that I'm hoping that the next president will call to really take a deep look at what fossil fuels are doing to community and how we move assets from the grifters that delivered us here to the people that need it. But we are going to see a thread of emerging cases. States are already searching for constitutional rights to be defended against climate change impacts and harm to their community. So if we are looking at multiple levels of legal interventions, the only thing that's missing is a judiciary that understands it.
I just want to ask you to elaborate on one point. You mentioned the intersection of racial justice and environmental justice, and I was watching a panel presentation that you did on climate justice and equity, and you mentioned that if we don't have people of color pushing in the streets, then it's not going to be possible for decision makers to surmount institutions that have been built to slow them down. Were you partially talking about the courts then? And also, can you elaborate a little bit more on why it's so important to see racial justice and environmental justice through the same prism?
Sure. I'm gonna have to look at when I said that, mostly because I think the current state of play is that we have a multiracial, multi-generational group of people surging in the streets, which is powerful for different reasons. I think it's important for impacted folks to be able to be advocates for themselves, and given COVID, in the safest ways possible. But relative to the kinds of threats we live under, yes, the court is a part of those solutions, because we cannot pretend that the only time that we are able to see change is in black and white. Like, the future is in technicolor. I'm going to use a really old term to describe color, right? But if we're looking at the future in technicolor, it means we have to be involved in what seem to be boring and dry and unsexy conversations about what public service commissions have to do, whether or not FERC is sending money all over the place. All of these things have to happen at the same time. And so for every person who's deeply committed to raising up the issues of environmental justice, climate justice, racial equity, this work all becomes a piece. It always has been, but environmentalists are having to examine the racist views that have informed the way we built the work. I mean, if you're over 100 years old, the word wilderness is in your organizational name, you're probably really guilty of being deeply racist, because you had to murder a lot of people to care about that piece of grass or the sage grouse. And so this is a moment where we have to talk about that, because the lack of diversity across the advocacy sector is not natural. It's by design. And so if we're going to have a chance at remaking the culture, building some new agreements, which is what's on deck either way, like, we're being pushed into a set of new agreements across all the branches, even if we don't do anything. So for activists, it feels like a really good opportunity to get into a conversation about writing all the things, as opposed to making enough reform to keep the status quo, which hasn't worked for us anyway.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Um, Dan, we have a comment coming in from the audience. Adam Cohn is asking a political question. He's saying, if the Democrats take the Senate, how do we convince elected Democrats to push for court expansion? So, what is the kind of political path here? Be interested in hearing from any and all of the panelists who want to weigh in on that.
Well, I think it's a two-step process. The first step is we have to convince the Senate Democrats to abandon the filibuster, because court expansion cannot happen in a world in which you need, 8 to 9 Republican senators to agree to it, because that obviously will not happen. And I think a huge part of this is making an argument, much like Mondaire made earlier, about why this is so important to our democracy, right? And like they were Senate Democrats are not going to do this unless we can make a compelling political case that they can take to their voters, right? And that can only work if we can do this in the context of, I think, voting rights and democracy. Is that the only way to fix it is to fix the court. And I think part of it is talking about how the court is an anti-democratic institution in of itself, right? 15 of the last 19, I believe the number is, justices were appointed by Republicans, even though Republicans have won the popular vote in this country one time since 1992. So that's part one. Part two is, I do believe that we need to get this accomplished and to get Senate Democrats on board, is we need a holistic solution that gets to a lot of the other issues that affect the court. And so that includes lower court expansion, because if you do population and size of the courts, there are backlog issues to be addressed there that go beyond any sort of partisan makeup and undoing what Trump did. Second, I think there is a very real conversation about how you deal with term limits, because the way the pattern of appointing justices in their 40s to serve several decades is one that goes against how this has been done how the Supreme Court was handled for many, many years. And so, what the problem with that is it creates this incredible distance between the political moment in which the justice was put on the court and when the decisions are made. And then the last thing I'd say is, I think our argument must be about the future. Because we have to make a case for why this is the right thing to do for everyone as part of a holistic package of democratic reforms. Includes voting rights, getting rid of the filibuster, getting rid of the electoral college, finding ways to make it so that billionaires like Mondaire's opponent cannot buy elections. What an argument that I do not think works is, look at what Mitch McConnell did, right? That they did it first is not a compelling political argument, at least to Democrats and independents around the country. And so I think it has to be part of a holistic argument. And that is why it's so important we're doing this panel right now. So we have to start making the argument now, because the moment for action is going to come, and we can't start making the argument on that day. And we can't wait for another adverse Supreme Court decision on any host of issues to make it.
Thank you so much. I want to apologize to the audience in advance. A lot of questions are coming in, and I can already see that we're not going to be able to get to all questions. But here's a question that kind of integrates across comments that all three of you have made, but also something Stacey Abrams said when she was talking about how to motivate young voters of color, and she was talking about the importance of overcoming defeatism and really giving people a sense that we can win. And Dan, you made the comment in your book that talking about the courts is an essential element of convincing voters that we can't win. And I don't know how to put this in terms of a sophisticated question, because I almost want to say, really? Is it, I mean, it seems like such an uphill battle yes, if we could kind of control, the way our message was heard, great. But in practicality, in reality, are we really going to be able to kind of build a motivated political electorate, especially youth voters of color, around the idea that courts are important? And that's a question for any and all of you.
Well, I'll just argue that I think it assumes that people don't know what's important. So I just want to undercut that really quickly and say that what I have seen working with youth activists, multi-generational groups of people who've been at this and who are just starting for the first time. 350.org is 11 years old, which makes us middle age in enviro time, right? So all things being equal, like, the argument for folks who are not as jazzed about this isn't that they don't feel like they're engaged. They just don't feel like it is a workable set of agreements. Like they're not being enrolled into a thing that has any benefits for them. They generally have more debt than anyone's ever seen. They do not have job prospects. They are talked down to by people who are supposed to be enveloping them in the thing that gets built. And so because we are not making any entrees to that group, they don't see themselves in this future. And so it is our job as people who are working for change to make this stuff sexy. Climate change is not sexy. Let me just flag that for you. Like there are no things about that make you want to get crunk. So I just want to put it out there that like climate change is a thing that's on the lips of the next generation because we made the appropriate arguments about how not acting would impact their future. So recognizing that this stuff is mystified on purpose. It is laden with jargon. It often feels dry. When some of the most interesting cases I've ever seen in any court involved, you know, like a goat, someone trying to get adverse possession over a casino land with some goats. So I would just say that like there are things we could do to make this stuff more interesting if we found a way to tell the story about what the future looks like. I think the reason Juliana was a successful, at least as a lightning bolt for folks thinking about their place, is because who is harmed is an appropriate question. Who is going to pay for that is another appropriate question. What are the bases of, like, those are, people spend a lot of time watching crime dramas for a reason. So I just think we need to do a better job of framing the crime, letting people know that this tool is as useful for any others, but to a point, and draw a bigger picture of how civics actually works for people if we apply it.
And really framing the crime as a crime.
Heck yeah. Like I'm super excited about all the people that we'll have to have real deep conversations and hearings about this with, because impacted communities, loss of life, literally fleeing your home, all of these things will become really public pieces of discussion. If we don't have a baseline of folks in the judiciary who get it, they will still be applying frameworks that no longer work to whether or not every one of us is going to become a climate refugee. The current number I looked at is 1 in 4 people. That's a lot of people. So like if we're having territorial disputes that are only political, we're never going to address whether or not that's appropriate, despite the way that the branches have separated some of these questions. There are other ways to get at it. And the reason we currently have this particular split is because we need more than one way of getting at it. So I'm just excited for us to do our jobs and making this stuff interesting, relevant, and given that we're like in the best case scenario, we'll go into months of attrition around what the future of the democracy looks like. It's probably a good time to start this conversation.
Aaron,
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I would just add that where climate may not be sexy for a lot of people, civil rights and civil liberties tend to be. There's no better way to get people interested in reforming the Supreme Court or expanding the Supreme Court than to talk about the right of women to have an abortion, right? And I was speaking with Senator Schumer a few weeks ago, and he was saying the Democrats at a poll, and the number one issue for young people wasn't the environment, it was actually racial justice, which maybe is not surprising given the moment that we find ourselves in. And of course, in my district, which is overwhelmingly white, the people who are leading these rallies are like young white kids who are leading their parents out by the hundreds to hear from people like me talk about systemic racism in our society and not just in policing. So I think that there is a lot of interest there could be a lot of interest among younger people, including young people of color, in expanding the court. And we just have to make sure that we are speaking precisely to them about what is at stake in a way that would matter to them. And I think there are a number of things that would.
Just want to riff directly off that, because Evan in the audience said that Munder Jones, in your excellent Salon article, you talked about DC statehood, and you said that if Congress grants DC statehood, then the Supreme Court might strike it down. And just asking for clarification, are you saying that DC statehood is unconstitutional, or that even if it's constitutional, the conservative justices are so cynical that they would just curtail the law or strike it down out of, I don't know, cynicism or partisan interest or what? Yeah, just I think Evan's asking for clarification.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. The Supreme Court decides what is constitutional, and that's unfortunate, and given the composition of the Supreme Court, which is an activist, far-right Supreme Court. And so I think that the Supreme Court would say it's unconstitutional, and that's deeply unfortunate. but it, I think, would be unsurprising. You know, any attempts that we've really made to enfranchise people have been met with skepticism, with statutes have been met with narrow interpretation. I'll take the opportunity to talk about something I recently read, which was an article by two law professors, or I should say, an article by two law professors. I've not read the actual law review that they wrote, but they summarized it for The Atlantic, I believe, recently.
Mm-hmm.
Their proposal is not to expand the Supreme Court, but rather to limit its jurisdiction. And I think it's an interesting proposal, but it skips over the fact that a judicial review is only one component. A judicial review being the process by which the Supreme Court decides whether a statute complies with the Constitution. In the vast majority of scenarios, the Supreme Court and lower courts are simply interpreting statutes that Congress has enacted. And because of the court packing by Republican administrations with far-right judges, they've given very narrow interpretations to any number of statutes, basically displacing the democratic process, whereby majorities in Congress, in the House, and in the Senate enacted pretty significant legislation that are then being curtailed. So that's the other piece. That's the other piece to this. It's not just interpreting statutes to see whether they comply with the Constitution, but it's just sort of defining what the statutes actually mean.
I want to pivot to a question from Pete Powell, but just to say briefly, I want to add to my 2 cents on that is I have really been mindful of the ways in which the court delivered a few quasi-moderate, extremely important decisions on reproductive justice and DACA and LGBTQ rights and guns this term, but at the same time with a few narrow exceptions, such as the other day's decision on Rhode Island. Pretty much every decision it's rendered on democracy and voting, and particularly Black and brown people voting over this term, have been terrible, including the Wisconsin decision that forced Wisconsin primary voters, disproportionately Black and brown, to choose their health or casting a ballot. Dan, Pete Powell is asking about the end game, which I think entails a lot of pieces. What Pete Powell asks is, how can we ever stop what happened to Merrick Garland from happening again? And sorry, I think there's a little background noise, so if you're not speaking, it would be great to mute, and I will mute myself in a second. But Pete Powell asks, so how do we keep that from happening again? And I guess more broadly, like, what is the end game here? Because if Democrats expand the court, Republicans are just going to retaliate, and then we're going to have a tit for tat of court expansions that would leave the court and the democracy in tatters.
This is an argument you hear a lot from a lot of folks, which is Democrats should not respond to what Mitch McConnell did, because then Mitch McConnell and whatever Republican is in charge will just do the same thing, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years. And I think first, we cannot as Democrats decide what we will and won't do based on what Mitch McConnell might do, right? I just think that is the wrong approach. There is a problem with the court. It is deeply threatening our democracy. It is threatening our ability to stop climate change. It is threatening every piece of the progressive agenda. We can only focus on what we can do. What we can do is reform the court with a holistic package of court reforms that includes expansion. And there are some steps that could be taken to make it harder for a Senate leader to do what Mitch McConnell did. The Senate could pass rules that would ensure that a Supreme Court nominee at least got an up or down vote. But ultimately, those rules can be changed, right? So I think what we have to do is we have to be bold in what we believe and go advocate it forcefully, and not spend our days and nights worrying about Mitch McConnell. Because if the idea is that if Democrats do something, I just refuse to accept the idea that it is bad for democracy for Democrats to do something that will overturn state-sanctioned suppression of the votes of Black and brown voters in this country. We are doing something that will improve our democracy by increasing participation. And so I do not care what Mitch McConnell might do in response. We cannot worry about it, because frankly, even if the Democrats do, let's say we do not take the Senate in this election, I think it is highly likely were a conservative justice for step down for some reason, if there's a vacancy that would shift the balance of the court, and if that were to happen on the first day of the Biden presidency, I think Mitch McConnell would hold that seat open for 4 years. And so we should be like, we have to do what we think is necessary to improve our democracy and to fix the court. We cannot think that our actions will determine what Mitch McConnell does, because he will do what is best for Republicans to hold power in this country without any regard for what Democrats do.
I'm gonna support that by saying that in climate time, we don't have, like, I look forward to worrying about 8 years from now. Like, like, I don't know that anybody who cares about the state of the world is really focused on 8 years from now with an eye towards fighting retaliation at that point. We're fighting retaliation right now. We're living in it. So if we're not taking every opportunity to move the needle in favor of, on behalf of climate people, not dying on a fiery gas ball, that, which is nonpartisan, by the way. Like, I just think it's really important for us to be smart about the other things that are on the table. We are in what Bill McKibben has always called a time test. And the time test has two numbers on it, 1 and 0. And so I just want to flag that, like worrying about what we can do today to create the infrastructure for tomorrow, because the day after that, we won't have any options. The end game is not doing enough on climate change and dying on a fiery gas ball. So I'm happy to move around some people in dresses to do that. Just want to flag that, like, of all the things I'm worried about, I'm not worried about retaliation.
Yeah, can I just bolster that point, because I think it's a really important point. And I would just make the observation that in 2016, when Mitch McConnell held open that ninth seat on the Supreme Court, that should have gone to Merrick Garland, a duly nominated, highly qualified jurist. That how were Republicans penalized? I mean, they took the White House, they got the House and the Senate. And it was only in 2018 that we took back the House, of course. So we have to stop fearing what the other party is going to do, because we know that they never care about what Democrats will do and what punishment, what backlash that they'll get when they do really far right things that are anti-democratic. I mean, we're just trying to get people health care in this country.
So yes, and I want to kind of push back on all of that by tapping into something that I heard Dan say on Pod Save, that that one way to understand kind of the realm of perspectives in the Democratic Party is not just in ideological terms between progressive and centrist Democrats, but between Democrats who believe that structural change is necessary to save the system, and between Democrats who believe that winning at the ballot box is what needs to be done, which I guess could also be expressed in terms of those who believe that democracy is dying, and those who don't. And so it sounds like people on this panel are pretty much clearly in the structural reform camp, but I mean, a lot of, Joe Manchins of the world are not. And so how are we going to talk to them?
We elect enough Democrats to the Senate that we don't have to worry about Joe Manchin.
We also take to the streets with so much fire that we give political cover to folks who needed to do the right thing and may have even wanted to do so, but didn't have enough energy to get past their own colleagues that would fight them. So just a flag that, like, multi-pronged offense coming here.
But isn't it enough just to keep winning elections? Like, it sounds like that, because if we win elections, that takes No,
I don't think winning elections is enough. If winning elections were enough, we could be fine. We could survive as a country. It's not even right to say conservative Supreme Court, because that imbues upon them a set of conservative legal principles we just happen to disagree with in philosophical terms. This is a Republican activist Supreme Court, right? Where, like, there may be a mixed record on some sets of rights issues, but and mixed, I think, is just pretty generous. But on questions that give Republican politicians more power, this Supreme Court always sides with what helps Republican politicians. And this goes back, this predates John Roberts. Bush v. Gore was my first experience. One of my first experiences in American politics was working for Al Gore and being in Florida and being told by every legal scholar who was advising our campaign that the judicial record here, legal precedent, said that they would rule for Gore, not Bush. And in a 5-4 decision to ensure not just that George Bush became president, but that George W. Bush would get to appoint 1 to 2 Supreme Court justices, they went against precedent and gave that election to George W. Bush. That is what Shelby County is about. That's what Citizens United is about. That is what the decision on gerrymandering last year is about. And we have to understand it in those terms and be very aggressive about it, because that is the world we are currently living in.
A political question moving forward, and Mondaire Jones is next congressman. There are no members of Congress now who are championing court expansion, and yet the Democratic Party just, I would say shockingly, announced in its party platform that it is calling for structural reform of federal courts. So parallel to that, there are a lot of questions now among groups that, if Democrats sweep back into power and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, get rid of the filibuster, kind of where would judicial reform fit into the conversation, on the assumption that, the Voting Rights Act will be, as you said, vulnerable to the courts on day one. So do you have any, I realize it's very early, primary just ended, but do you have thoughts on what the politics of judicial reform look like if Democrats return to power?
Yeah, well, let me say that I think there's a lot of support in Congress. You just don't see people running on it right now because they don't want it to become an issue in this election. We're already doing pretty well at the presidential level when you look at the polling, and I hope that bears out. And of course, I'll be that champion in Congress, so I'm looking forward to that. But look, in an ideal world, this would be one feature of H.R. 1. Because I really think that I'm just a huge fan of H.R. 1. These democracy reforms, these big structural improvements to our democratic processes are critical to, as I mentioned earlier, obtaining and preserving progressive legislative victories by making it more likely that we will have durable democratic majorities. I don't want to have to be worrying about just sort of outperforming the curve every midterm election and losing the House and the Senate, when we know that if things were done fairly, right? If congressional districts, if no congressional district in America were gerrymandered, we would always have a majority of Democrats in the House of Representatives. For example, if we did automatic voter registration, we would make it so much more likely that these swing states, these purple states, would elect and continue to elect Democratic senators. So in an ideal world, I think court expansion would be one feature of H.R. 1, so we can get that done all at once. And I think there's also more support for filibuster reform than people are letting on to as well, because they don't want that to be a campaign issue this year.
What about just more moderate judicial reform options that might be an easier sell, like term limits or a code of conduct for Supreme Court justices? Wouldn't that do the trick?
A code of conduct. There's supposed to be there is a code of conduct. It governs recusal, for example. But we need something more affirmative than that. I'll be honest with you. I'm not there on term limits. I actually think that really politicized. I don't want judges thinking. First of all, I don't want to be able to predict when judges are going to, have to retire. The judiciary is supposed to be inoculated from partisan politics, and it's unfortunate that there is such an activist majority on the court right now that I'm seeking to rebalance, which is less about getting more Democrats and more about getting people who are going to uphold democratically enacted statutes in Congress. And part of the lifetime tenure on the bench is that you are supposed to be inoculated by virtue of that from political partisan interference. And I don't want judges thinking, okay, well, if I rule this way, I won't get a job on Fox News after this is over. Shout out to Chief Justice Roberts, who has made a few decisions that go against the base of his party. And I don't know that I think he's now persona non grata. Having said that, he's still been an awful jurist on the Supreme Court, and I would love for him to leave.
So I'm sad we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to give panelists an opportunity to have the last word. And I'd like to just say a few words about Take Back the Court. Maybe we could just go to each panelist and see if you have a couple minutes of closing remarks. And if not, and or after you're done, then I'll speak for a minute about Take Back the Court. Tamara, would you
Sure.
like to start the closing remarks? Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to jump in and say one of the remarks in the chat was about look at the staying power that the notorious RBG has. I feel like everyone's lighting a candle in their basement hoping she doesn't like step on a thumbtack. Like, so flagging that, like, not politicizing this one branch because it hasn't really worked well for all the other work that we want to accomplish, having more than one strategy going into whether or not the democracy will continue to be a good experiment seems like a good idea. From the perspective of climate folks, we're not just here for the Supreme Court, but really a conversation about the courts in general, how we are making losses down the line if the jurisdictions are not working together with a cogent theory of change, with a current theory of the case around how you can prosecute folks who are harming people as they fall dead in the street over what is happening in the space of climate. You know, that has to happen in every branch. So we're really committed to pushing for a reform, because the other alternative is we're ready for that too. It's just messier. So just want to flag that on behalf of all the folks who are barely holding on to the idea of a democracy, we should probably try this because it's much more chill.
Thank you so much. Dan?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to your question about the politics of this and within Congress. And I want to say that, you know, on issues like this, just like with filibuster reform and a few other things, change happens slowly, then suddenly. And I think we're in the suddenly point on court expansion. And you brought up the division that I've talked about in the party, which is there was a divide between people who thought Donald Trump broke our democracy and people who believed, as everyone on this panel does, that we have Donald Trump because our democracy is broken. And what has been really interesting it's really in the last like 4 to 5 months is that there has been, that divide has narrowed greatly. And you now have working together the folks who have been advocating for structural democratic reforms on the filibuster, on the Supreme Court, on a whole bunch of other issues, working hand in hand with the progressive movement organizations like 350 and so many others who care passionately about the progressive agenda. There's this recognition that the issues we care about will always be precarious if we allow Brett Kavanaugh to have a veto on climate change legislation or on Medicare for all legislation, right? And so I am very optimistic. There's a lot of work to do to convince a lot of people, both in Congress and around the country about this, but we have the best folks now working on it. And you have the combination of people making arguments, you know, next year in Congress, like Mondaire, but also people like Tamara on the streets doing this. And so I think that makes me very optimistic about something that seemed impossible to imagine this time last year.
Thank you so much. Mondaire?
Yeah, like Dan and Tamara, I too am optimistic about what we're going to be able to achieve on this. I think it speaks volumes that it was adopted in the party's platform, whereas other things that, you know, some people perhaps would have been more surprised about were rejected, right? Like the legalization of marijuana, which should no longer be controversial in our society. So, you know, I'm really looking forward to renewing this discussion in the next Congress. I'm so pleased to see support from other folks who are also going to be members of the freshman class. And I think that what we're doing right now is exactly what we need to be doing, which is talking about this, preparing for this, anticipating arguments in response, making sure that progressives are united in support of this kind of reform, and really using their power strategically in Congress, you know, as a block, hopefully. And making sure that leadership is aware of how urgent this crisis is, because the crisis is here. If we do nothing, all of the things that we care about, from addressing the climate crisis to ensuring healthcare for everybody, and franchising people right now is something that should not be controversial. And as I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court is hostile to. Nothing changes if we don't expand the Supreme Court. So we have to act like the crisis is already here And then once we establish that as a floor, we can, I think, get people around the idea of doing something about it.
Thank you so much. I'll say a word or two in closing. I also, in addition to running Take Back the Court, I'm a political science professor, and my own perspective is that the radicalization of the Republican Party is perhaps the greatest threat to the planet, as pretty much the only party in the world that doesn't believe in climate change. Professor Timothy Snyder at Yale says that once a political party is committed to lying, then pretty much anything is possible. And so I believe that if our generation survives climate change, historians will look back and see the fundamental question of our era as whether the Democrats can add 40 to 50 million voters to the rolls and keep them there before the Republicans drive us into a tyrannical outcome. And so I started Take Back the Court 2 years ago at a time when the idea of court expansion was off the radar and had not been talked about for 81 years. And there were no thought leaders in favor of the idea, and there were no organizations in favor of the idea. And fast forwarding today to today, I'm so proud that thought leaders like the folks here on today's panel are calling for expansion. 17 progressive organizations including 350.org, are calling for expansion, and senators like Mazie Hirono are saying that they're potentially open to court expansion. The politics, as Dan said, are changing really, really fast. I do believe that there is a path back to restoring democracy and addressing emergencies like climate change, and that it's going to require expanding the court to get there. I want to thank Netroots Nation so much. Again, my colleague Murshid Zahid, the panelists today, all of you are awesome. I am so inspired by all of you, Mandir Jones, Tamara Tolles O'Loughlin, and Dan Pfeiffer. For more information and research about the issue, please visit takebackthecourt.today, and hope you all have a wonderful conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's great discussion, everybody.
Thank you.